Select your program.
Dialogue.
Program initiated.
Approach the threshold. Engage rationality. Open your mind. Godspeed.
Beaming down to your listening devices, this is Flagship Freedom, the podcast that places you on the front line in the war of ideas. My name is Michael.
And I'm Dan.
And we welcome you to a fun-filled, exciting dialogue episode. This is the first of many where we are inviting guests, both listeners or noteworthy libertarians, anarchists, people of all different walks of life and philosophies, to come on the show and discuss with us a variety of topics. Today we have a guest named Andy, one of Danny's longtime acquaintances, and we have a very good conversation about a great many things. I think that it was overall a productive and interesting conversation that I'm excited to share with everybody. Definitely something that we're going to have to do once more with him in the near future. I think that Andy's a smart guy and he's got a lot to say, and we definitely did not cover that within the hour that we were talking with him.
Yeah, we certainly opened a lot of doors to dive down in the future, but productive nonetheless to at least establish the baseline and understand where everybody's coming from, their philosophy, their worldview. So that's valuable.
Right. So without further ado, here we go.
So today we have a very special guest, Andy. He and I go back a bit of a ways on Facebook, sort of through mutual friends, and we have had many a political sparring. And I've always been impressed with Andy's intelligence and ability to articulate his ideas. We have very different political and social views, but I believe it's really important to get people of intelligence to try to hash out their differences because, I think the importance is we are building the bricks right now. And if we neglect to hash out the war of ideas through conversation, it can lead to uglier things. You get brothers on the opposite sides of civil war. We never want things to devolve into violence. So ideas, that's where we really need to do the legwork, in my opinion. So without further ado, Andy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a law student now, but when we started talking on Facebook, I was just out of undergrad, where I was a philosophy major, and I mostly did ethics and political philosophy there.
Ooh.
And I remember being frustrated in some of my classes that kind of as far right as we were willing to go in a lot of political philosophy classes was John Rawls, who you might or might not know, but he's a very famous kind of 20th century political philosopher who kind of defended egalitarian liberalism and a system of egalitarian redistribution, and that is not very far to the right. And that was kind of the rightmost boundary of the conversation. And then that was defining the boundaries of the conversation, that was about as libertarian as we got. And it was frustrating to me because while I understand that not a lot of people in those classrooms were libertarians, it's still something that a lot of people believe to varying degrees. And so it's important to talk about it and engage with, libertarians and actually think through the reasons why we're not libertarians instead of just chugging along kind of uncritically. So that's why I kind of always like talking to people who are politically a little bit different than what you find, on a lot of college campuses. Not that there are no libertarians there, but they're somewhat underrepresented, and I think underrepresented in the curriculum also, which is a little bit unfair, and I think maybe a little bit closed-minded.
Yeah, for as radical as some might view libertarians, I found an equal amount of individuals on college campuses back when I was in university that were they were also the undesirable sort of element that you would rather not converse with, and that kind of put off a lot of people. So I definitely sympathize with why some students think, oh my God, look I don't want anything to do with these people. They're nutty, they're crazy, they're unsophisticated in their arguments, they're unwashed and bearded folks, and we don't want anything to do with them. So I do, to a certain extent, sympathize, because in my university, the libertarians were markedly as such. I happen to think...
I don't know. I like most of the libertarians I meet.
Well, you went to
a little bit harsh.
It is very harsh. Yeah, maybe you went to a university that has more sophisticated libertarians than myself. That must be the case. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that it is important to engage in the dialectic. I think that's the only way to move things forward, and that's how things, whether it be philosophical or scientific progression, hashing out differences and battling them out in a public forum is one of the best notions that I can think of. So, Danny, I know you've chatted with Andy far more than I, and through, I imagine, the unintelligible and difficult methods of Facebook, where it's back and forth. People are sitting next to the keyboard just waiting for the next response. I know I've done it. It sounds like Andy's done it, and it is so painful. But I was never privy to those discussions, and I'm very interested in hearing perhaps some of the main points of contention, or perhaps some of the, actually maybe even taking a step back, some of the topics of your conversation.
Yeah, well, I think this would be a good opportunity for Andy to sort of encapsulate as much as possible without losing all the nuance of your political, social worldview or your belief systems. And specifically, we're interested in the notion of the state and whether it is the best way to organize society. Of course, you know that we're coming from the position that we reject the state. We believe that practically and morally it's not desirable. But of course, we disagree on that. So I'll let you, Andy, if you could just sort of describe in general terms where you're coming from, and then we can dive into any number of specific topics.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that my position is that I know the best way to organize society. But and I wish I had something more original in the way of political views, but I guess I can be helpful as kind of a token mainline egalitarian liberal redistributionist or something like that. In ethics, I kind of tend towards a view known as utilitarianism.
Yeah,
which basically just says, for any viewers who don't know, that you should maximize, kind of well-being or happiness in the world, and you shouldn't kind of discriminate between different types of things that can feel happiness, like different types of people. So people who are, from your country or from your family or from your race or whatever, and then to push it further, you maybe shouldn't even discriminate between humans and animals. And so you're trying to maximize the happiness of everything that can feel happiness, and as a corollary of that, minimize all the pain and suffering. And so that's different from a view of the world where you're thinking in terms of rights, and there's kind of absolute, or maybe not absolute, but very strong prohibitions that are rules that you're not supposed to violate. So like the non-aggression principle, no initiating violence is a rule. Whereas under utilitarianism, you could initiate violence if it would maximize happiness in the world. And I'm not sure I really believe utilitarianism like to the extremes, but I kind of think it's a useful way to think through how to address a problem in society.
Well, I'm sorry, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to ask, just so that I can pin down a little bit of the details further. In your version of utilitarianism, I assume it's some sort of, well, I don't want to assume, so that's why I'm asking. Is this some sort of Millsian utilitarianism, or do you have consequentialism? I know that sort of meshes in together with utilitarianism too, where you're measuring consequences as well as measuring the deficits and additives of goods and evils. So sort of like an equation, yes?
Yeah, exactly. It's like cost-benefit analysis, and utilitarianism is just one kind of consequentialism. So consequentialism is you're supposed to be maximizing some kind of consequence, and happiness or well-being is just one kind of consequence. And there are other consequentialists who say, happiness is important too, but there are also other things we want to maximize, like maybe knowledge or truth or justice or something like that, something other than happiness.
Go ahead.
I don't really buy too much into those types of other types of consequentialism, but they're out there, and utilitarianism is probably the most important.
Right. So in your mind, when we're talking about particular what some people would call universals or virtues such as justice, peace, happiness, egalitarianism, are these not so much universalities, rather they're just means to a possible consequence, or they can be consequences in and of themselves? Are they interchangeable, or is always the end, for instance, are they I suppose tools, like justice is a tool to maximize happiness in your mind, or are these virtues the end goal in like a larger grand scheme?
I think the first one. So egalitarianism is, I use that word to describe myself, but I might not really be an egalitarian in the sense that I only care about equality to the extent that it makes people better off. And so if you think about economic inequality, I think I think it's pretty clear that some economic inequality is a good thing, because it gives people incentives to work hard and all of that. Okay. And so you want a little bit of inequality. You know what I mean? You don't want like total leveling. But it might also be possible for inequality to go to such extremes economically that you see a concentration of political power that comes with a concentration of wealth that people might abuse. And also, because of the idea of diminishing marginal returns, like how each dollar you earn is worth less to you than the last dollar. And so, your first, dollar a day is like the difference between life and death. And then, your second dollar a day means maybe you're getting a little bit more protein. And then by the time you're up to your, I don't know, your millionth dollar a day, another dollar a day, it doesn't even matter to you. You're getting a little bit more mileage. You can get like a slightly more expensive, whatever pool. But it's not really improving your life that much. And so when you have people who are really, really rich, that's where I think that you have opportunities to create big gains in well-being through redistribution. And so, that was a long answer, but that's kind of an example of how I see the egalitarianism as a means to an end. But I don't think it's not good for its own sake. It's only good indirectly because it might have the potential to make people better off.
And Andy, you bring up a very interesting point, something I would say even more than just sympathetic to, the idea that ideas, and actually more so morals, are also a means to an end, because we don't believe they exist unto themselves. It would be pointless. Like, there are reasons we don't have morals, like you may not wear pink polka dots, because we recognize that would be totally pointless. We have these, you could say, generalizations like don't steal, don't murder, etc., because I would argue nobody is God, nobody is omnipotent, and nobody can see around the corner of history or know the value equation for every single person in the world. So that is, I would argue, why we have these, you could say, generalizations that fit probably 99% of scenarios. Don't steal, each person owns their body. Now you could come up, everybody tries to disprove the generality with a lifeboat scenario. Like, well, would you steal if you were starving out in the middle of the desert and there was a guy selling water bottles for $1 million? Of course, the answer is, well, in situations like that, the rules weren't really tailored to these extreme scenarios. So while I totally agree with you from this utilitarian standpoint, I think everybody ultimately realizes that we're trying to maximize good for people, I still fall back on those rules, those moralities, because everybody thinks they know how to run the world and how best to do everything. But it seems to work out when you have these basic ground rules like, hey, I don't think that's good for you. However, I'm not you. I'm not running your life. I don't really know what the way to maximize happiness and well-being in your life. Therefore, I'm going to allow you the choice to opt out or to spend your money how you wish, etc. And that's, I think, where maybe we diverge, is the idea of sort of benevolent rulership versus individualism.
Yeah, I mean, I also think you need to have kind of rules of thumb or generalizations that you follow. I'm not sure how extreme I think that lifeboat scenarios are. I mean, if you look at something like very, very poor people negotiating for wages, it starts to look a little bit like a bottle of water for $1 million in the desert scenario. It's not quite as extreme, but it has some of the same, flavor that rule might not be tailored for. And so it might be a reason to consider having something like a universal basic income or a minimum wage, or to have labor union protections. So I agree that it's a good generalization, but I just wonder if, how marginal and how rare those bottle of water in the desert situations are.
So I would pose a question to you then. Everybody, or at least all the competing political parties, seem to have their idea of how to maximize human happiness, utilitarianism. So the question is, who's going to win out? And I think really what it boils down to, what separates anarchists from the notion of statism, is, do we allow people to opt out? Like, I personally, truly, with all of my heart, believe, both empirically and logically, that voluntarism, aka anarcho-capitalism, is the way to maximize well-being, equality, etc. And the reason I got into it in the first place was because I was very concerned about poverty, and I looked up the correlation between economic freedom and prosperity. And lo and behold, I found all these metrics were positively correlated, generally speaking. So I guess a question I would pose to you, not to put it too bluntly, is would you allow or support people going off, basically opting out of the system, opting out of Social Security, opting out of basically the state? Now, of course, not being able to murder and kill people, because those are rules which even anarchists support, the non-aggression principle. But beyond that, how would you feel about people voluntarily opting out of the state?
I mean, I'm not like totally opposed to it, and I think it would be interesting to see what would happen, because I don't know. And I mean, I have some guesses, but I don't really know. And it's interesting you say you think it's empirically the best, because it hasn't really been tried. Not that it wouldn't work, but just we don't know. I mean, like, we can guess, and your guess is probably different than my guess, but the main risk with letting people opt out is that the state kind of has beneficiaries than people who are made maybe worse off by it. And also, the state is providing a lot of kind of public goods, or maybe things like road security, whatever, that people probably benefit. Like, everybody, maybe not everybody, but lots of people benefit from American military hegemony, and you can't really have somebody, opt out of the benefits of that. But you can have someone opt out of paying into the system. And so the worry is that you get kind of free riders who opt out of the system and continue to benefit from it in some ways, without paying into it. Or you get a situation where lots of people who have high tax burdens leave, and the welfare state collapses because it doesn't have enough revenue. So I would be concerned about those sorts of problems. But on a small scale, those problems wouldn't materialize. So it would be something to try on a smaller scale, maybe.
So then, if I may jump in, Danny, if this would be permissible on a small scale, at what point would the limit be in your mind? I know I'm putting you on the spot, and perhaps that's not fair because I'm not trying to get actual number out of it per se, but do we stop allowing people once we start to see a diminishment of the quality of services provided by the welfare state? Or do we just let these people go on and try it out? And if it's working, then more and more people can join?
Well, I don't know. I would probably need to know a little bit more about the scenario you're envisioning. Is it like there's some geographical area that people move to, or is it like they stay where they are, but they just don't pay taxes and drug laws don't apply to them?
Well, okay, yeah. So there are two scenarios that I could envision. Let's say, and these are of course hypotheticals that I'm drawing from instances of literature and also of what is going on right now. You've got the first idea, the sort of Henry David Thoreau model of civil disobedience, of simply not paying taxes,
which of course some people do.
And that's absolutely right. And in Disobedience, he talks about how he understands that he is receiving a certain amount of protection under the aegis of the government, but he believes that the taxes that he is paying are going to immoral acts for which he does not want to participate in, which is enslaving a larger population, which is doing benefit. What was going on was the Mexican War at the time, and also slavery. So clearly, these were big institutionally pushed problems. Both of them were supported by government. And he wanted to opt out of these things. So you've got that one situation, and then the other one is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it's called the Free State Society. Yes, Danny, in New Hampshire.
Yep. Free State Project.
Free State Project. Yes. So
yeah, I actually am familiar. Yeah.
You are, okay. So for my listeners, for our listeners, I'll go over briefly that it's a conglomeration of individuals who have volunteered to move to a part of New Hampshire being a relatively unpopulous state, but it is, a member of the Union. And they've moved to a section of land, and they've set up their own system of government that is apart from our federal government. Now, Danny, I'm not sure. I don't think that they pay taxes, both federal and state. Am I correct?
That I don't know. Okay,
I'm almost certain that they do not pay federal. But I'll fact check myself and I'll mention it in the show notes. But they may pay state. But either way, it is Danny and I's contention that we would, in an ideal situation, in a just and moral situation, that there would be no taxes paid for which we do not agree firsthand. So I threw a lot at you, those two different models. So I'm interested in hear your thoughts of both of them.
My understanding of the Free State Project is that the goal is to get enough libertarians to move there that they can essentially, vote into, take majority control of the legislature, the state legislature.
Yes, I do believe that's the ultimate goal for the Free State Project. That's right.
That would be fine, and it would be interesting. We have some states already that are more or less libertarian. We don't exactly have a state that's libertarian across the board, but we have some states that are more or less libertarian in certain areas. We have states that are more or less redistributive. We have states that have more or less, strict drug policies. We have states that have, better or worse run police forces.
Right.
And the one problem that can arise with that in the federal system, and maybe a reason why the U.S. is not a great place for this sort of experimentation, is that you can't really stop the federal, benefits, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, from coming into the state. You can't stop federal drug laws. You can't stop any of these federal rules that affect the way that states are run. So it's not a great kind of what's the word, like a guinea pig for libertarianism, because it's always going to be, there's a lot of confounds and other factors involved. And I think that's true for other, kind of libertarian experiments too, where you have, I don't know, there's something inherently libertarian about Bitcoin, but I think there's kind of an association between libertarianism and Bitcoin and some of the ideological motivations for the creation of Bitcoin, whereas, escaping from central bank run currencies. But Bitcoin is another example of an experiment where it's just too tempting for people who are doing bad things, not because that's necessarily the case. It's just when you create a haven from government oversight, it just becomes the first thing that happens is it becomes a magnet for people who are trafficking drugs or humans or other such things. And it's a problem for testing libertarianism, not because at a certain point, like if you had a whole society that was libertarian, you'd have good people and bad people, and it would work out okay. The problem is creating a society like that where enough good people get a foothold before lots of bad people get a foothold. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Andy, that we're sort of in a mixed system where it's hard to gauge variables independently because everything's wrapped up. You have government sort of crowding out a lot of what could be provided by the free market. So the transition is a challenge, and there's debates. Do we go cold turkey? Do we slowly over time, et cetera? But what a shame it would be to never quit snorting crack because the withdrawals would be too hard, right?
Yeah.
If I could ask a question, it's one thing I think I notice people engaging in this sort of controlling mindset that I don't think they would otherwise. And I think it's people's attachment to the status quo is because the unknown is always kind of scary. Of course, there's a good reason why we prefer tried and true tested methods. But there's something in me that just really rebels against the idea that people have to prove 6 ways from Sunday that everything that they want to do to be free is going to work out, and they have to address every conceivable situation. And I guess my point is, I think if we lived in a freer society, when you bring up the concept of a state, like, hey, do you think we should have a monopoly on currency, and if people choose to opt out of it, they should be locked up just for using an alternative means of exchange? Or likewise, if we lived in a society where drugs were legal and we said, hey, what if somebody wants to try a substance that makes them feel happy, and if they do that, we get to throw them in jail? I think people would really rebel mentally against that sort of, I don't want to use the word control freak, but that's what comes to my mind. And I'm not saying you're a control freak, but I think people have a hard time letting go of the status quo, and we end up wanting to maintain control over other people in a sense that I think is really unnatural. Like, we would feel very uncomfortable to go to our neighbor and walk into his house and tell him what he can or cannot do. But yet we find ourselves having this exception where anything that the state controls, we believe, is totally justified. And it sort of removes us from the visceral morality that we would feel if we had the gun to the person and said, hey, you put that plant down right now, or I'm going to continually escalate violence until you comply or die. And that's, I really rebel against the idea that people have to prove out everything they want to do in order to earn their freedom. And that's why I stick to the moral side most of the time. I think empirically it's great to prove how anarchy could work and libertarianism is preferable economically, et cetera. And I'm happy to do that. And I think there's lots of data. But at the end of the day, a lot of times you end up agreeing to disagree, so to speak. And that's a really frustrating situation because it's like, I don't want to continue to fund the war on drugs. I don't want to fund the war in Iraq, et cetera. But, how much more of this soft slavery do we have to endure before we can just let people be free, which I think is kind of a a natural state. And I realize I threw a lot out there, but what I'm getting at is the concept of holding on to control versus I believe it's a lot more natural to allow people to live and let live. Maybe that's an unfalsifiable, too vague to even address, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of things to say about that. I mean, you're talking earlier about people being reluctant to try things new, and I think there's a kind of built-in conservatism. Not, I don't mean like conservatism like, Ronald Reagan. I mean conservatism like people being cautious about changes in the way society functions, because whatever problems we have in society, and I think this works against every kind of reformer. I mean, it's a tendency that works against anarchist reformers. It's a tendency that works against progressive reformers. It's a tendency that works against, socialist reformers or what any type of reformer. Is that people are reluctant to change. And I think the reason is that however things are going right now, we at least know it's not like some kind of disaster on an unimaginable scale. Like,
right, it's not hell.
People have enough. Right, people have enough to eat, and only a very small percentage of the population dies violently, and a smallish percent of the population is addicted to substances, and so on and so forth.
We normalized it.
Right, and we know we know it's not, like you said, it's not hell, it's not the apocalypse, and if we mess with it, we could it could be like we had a good thing going and then we messed with it and we ruined it. And so I think people are very cautious, and maybe that makes sense. You said that people shouldn't have to prove things empirically. I think that like a major overhaul of society would be a pretty good thing. You want the evidence to be as good as possible. I mean, I know you can't know with absolute certainty what's going to happen, but it's something that important, and on that scale, it would be really nice to know as much as possible. And earlier someone mentioned this kind of a correlation between, all these quality of life metrics, whatever, median income, life expectancy, et cetera, and economic freedom. It's not quite how I would interpret the data. I know the sort of stuff you're talking about. I think the Heritage Foundation has like a nice
that is one
map
source.
or something. Yeah. Because the countries that top the quality of life indexes are like Canada and Sweden and I don't know, Germany, and I don't really see those as like paragons of libertarian notion of economic freedom. They do some things right on a libertarian view. I mean, it's not they're not like extremely repressive totalitarian regimes, which I think everybody agrees is terrible, right? And earlier you mentioned that you think lots of people sort of uncritically assume that anything the state is doing is justified. I don't think that's true either. I think virtually everybody has objections to something that the state they're living in is doing, myself included. But to return to the previous point, I don't see Sweden as especially libertarian. They have, I guess, free trade, relatively lenient immigration rules, and they have a free press, but they also have, very strong and also coercive protections for unions, and have very high taxes. So I'm not sure it's a great example.
Yeah, and we could, walk through each one of those point by point, like not to jump into it, but I do believe with that, unfortunately, you're dealing with many, many variables in an entire country. But as you start to parse those out, you do see a correlation. Again, I don't expect you to buy this hook, line, and sinker right now, but in any case, we in lieu of having to prove everything out, which again, I personally believe libertarians have the data on their side, but let's say that it was a wash, so to speak. What could you do in the absence of some kind of compelling empirical case? is there anything else that people can do who want to be free? Like, is there any moral case to be made?
Well, yeah. I'm not. I mean, so as a strategic question, like, how do we get people to agree with us? There definitely is a moral case to be made. Is it a right case? Is it true? I don't know. I mean, that's like, it's more of like a perennial philosophical question that's never going to go away. But strategically, I mean, you can convince people.
Yeah, certainly.
All sorts of things, and anarchism is definitely one of them.
I'm quite opposed to the idea that one must, and I guess I would be in opposition to a consequentialist position here, but I've always been opposed to the idea that I want to prove myself being right in the moment if I can simply convince the person to a point that I may or may not find true, but in fact I won the argument, I have won the will of that individual, and therefore they can follow along me to do, what have you. And that's sort of the idea that so I guess this gets into the, universalities and truth for truth's sake and all that, and the best mode of governance. But even if the best mode of governance was, let's say, if the best mode of government was not libertarianism, and it was a very staunch egalitarian centralized government, then, and I knew that. And I knew that very well. I would damn well be sure that I would never be justifying or lying to anybody about the morals of libertarianism. It ends up stemming to some of the core principles that I believe in, and I don't think that these are necessarily relative core principles. I think that there are certain baseline metrics that we can share, and perhaps for you and I, happiness might be a very big one, but essentially, what I'm getting at is that if I allow the maximum amount of freedom for individuals to allow them to pursue their interests, that they are able to govern themselves accordingly. And I think perhaps you and I might have a difference in terms of what we expect people would do with that freedom. Perhaps they would resolve to their basic human instincts of infighting and tribalism and the will to power, some type of Nietzschean will to power. What do you think about that?
I guess I don't really know what would happen. I mean, one expectation I would have, well, I guess I would have a couple expectations.
Yeah.
I should also say at some point that I don't think we really agree about what freedom is and about what coercion is.
Okay.
And if I'm kind of letting it slide and not quibbling every time you guys mention freedom, because we get really bogged down. But I sort of want it on the record that I doubt we agree about what freedom is.
That'd be a good subject to talk about. Then I'm not sure if that's bogging down, but but go ahead and go ahead. What were you saying first?
So I was just saying, what I don't know if people would resort to their baser instincts exactly, but I think that you would probably see some inefficiencies caused by collective action problems. Mm-hmm. So things like in road building, it's not that you can't build a private road, but obviously, I think that there would be hurdles in doing things like acquiring land where people who realize that they have parcels of land that would make the road as a whole much cheaper become holdouts, and the cost of the road increases. And so that's just one example of a type of collective action problem. Another is bankruptcy. If you have a bunch of debts, you can't pay them, and your creditors are going to think, if I'm the first to go in there and demand my money, I might get paid in full. And if I'm last in line, I might not get paid anything. And so you have a rush. It's kind of like a run on a bank, where everybody goes to the creditor and starts demanding their money. And as a result, there is less left for everybody. And so government can resolve those types of collective action problems. I would also expect for there to be less, obviously less redistribution, because one thing we do have good data on is how much money people donate to charity. And I think that how that amount could be influenced some by by culture and persuasive campaigns and things like that. But people, particularly rich people in the United States, donate something like 1.5 or 2% of their income to charity, which is a lot less than you would need to finance, kind of private sector charitable equivalents of the welfare state. And when we see tax rates go down, we don't see that number spike up. So it's not like people are not donating to charity just because their tax burden is so onerous. And you would also see charity tends to go down in amount when it's needed the most. So if you have a financial crisis, the amount of charity you would see would decrease. And then when times are good, the amount of charity would increase because people have more money to donate, but it's not, it's not needed as much, whereas governments can engage in deficit spending to try to counteract those tendencies. I think it would be harder for consumers to get information. Like right now, we have government inspections that we are able to make decisions as consumers on the basis of. And I believe that you kind of need, I guess you'd say, coercive investigations to obtain that information. And I think that corporations tend to be pretty opaque. We often think of politicians as being very opaque, but it's pretty rare to see a CEO, talk about kind of, I think there's like a reluctance to let journalists see the inner workings. And so I think it's hard to look into those types of issues without some kind of coercive authority. And then you have classic, problems of irrationality. So, people not saving up for retirement because, I should save for retirement, but I can spend this money now. It'll be more fun and I can worry about it later. It's basically from procrastination. You have, drug and substance abuse, which are probably the amount that people would consume of those things in the absence of any government intervention is probably way too much. Which is not to say that I agree with the war on drugs. I don't, but I think that we should have high taxes on those things.
You mean a legalization of drugs, but high taxes on those items for people to consume?
Yeah,
okay,
something like
Got
that.
it.
Or at least that's a good place to start because it's great. We kind of went from 0 to 60. Like the war on drugs is an extreme overreaction, and I think that you should maybe start with taxes and then ramp up a little bit if you need to. But like, it's crazy to go from nothing to locking people up, and then lastly, I think you would have maybe some problems with externalities like air pollution. And some of those problems could be resolved or mitigated. And I don't think that's, resorting to our baser instincts exactly. But I do think that those would be some pretty serious problems that libertarian society would have to address.
Yeah.
That was a long answer. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I would love to dive into each one of those. I don't think we have time to do that. So
no, we're not.
And that's okay. I would, in this case, approach it from a more general scale. One of my favorite voluntarist philosophers, Jeffrey Tucker, he said the state is ignorant, presumptuous, and arrogant because there are complex social problems out there. And to address those, you need a nuanced, ever-evolving, ever-critical approach with creative destruction, and you need to allow failed solutions, which are not solutions, to pass away. And I would argue that the best, most efficient way to do that is to put people's actual tangible financial interests at stake through the experimentation of the market, where you have personal incentives, the profit incentive, etc. And I guess to put it even more generally, I can't think of an instance where a coercively imposed monopoly is ever preferable to achieve any good. And, whether you're talking the effectiveness or also the morality, like, you have to contend with the immorality of eminent domain of stealing people's land, which is kind of at odds with the ability.
you're not exactly. I mean, you pay them,
I
but they don't
suppose,
have a
but
choice. So it's kind of a weird. It would be
yeah,
like
to a degree.
right,
Yeah.
it would be like a thief running up and taking your handbag and then paying you the fair market value of the handbag. Which the problem is that you didn't agree to sell it. But it's not. It's definitely better than.
Yeah,
not
it's certainly
getting
true.
it.
It's better than getting 100% ripped off. But yeah, I guess my main thrust is that, I always hear statists arguing incredibly concerned about monopolies and voluntary monopolies at that, or free market monopolies, I should say. And here we are supporting, or I should say, here they are supporting this central monopoly, which I might add, the experiment in the smallest one ever is resulting in $20 trillion of debt. To me, that's not success, and we may be missing the potential successes. We can look at it and be pretty proud of ourselves, but what could we have if we allowed, a free, continually evolving market solution where there may be solutions we have no idea of, like, there's the classic example of people who actually literally pontificated about how we were going to have agriculture and cotton without slaves picking. And there's one of those things where you revert back to, we shouldn't have to prove yourself to the slave owner. You should run away and fall back on the moral principles. And I realize you're a utilitarian, and it's hard to walk that line. But at what point do we let go and not need everybody's? I should say, when everybody doesn't need permission to live free and to institute these solutions for complex social problems, like roads, for example. We had roads before we had income tax in this country. I can think of a lot of ways.
There are other taxes.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe that's a bad example, but maybe right now companies are getting off freer than they would. Maybe they would pay for roads because it's more convenient to allow people to travel in an area like near Walmart, et cetera. I mean, that's just one potential solution. There's many ideas out there, things which we never could have imagined in the first place, is what I'm saying. And to round off my point, I'm going on a huge rant here. We don't know the solution.
Yeah.
We don't know the solutions unless we allow that creativity to flourish. If we slap on this government control, things in the government tend to get codified into a fossil, and they never change because there's no financial incentive. You just go into debt or print money. Whereas in the free market, you're continually seeing this innovation.
Yeah.
And I apologize for making vast claims which are hard to address.
No, we're talking about political philosophy. It's all about vast claims that are hard to address. That's the whole point. I mean, the idea ideally is to hybridize some of the benefits of each, right? So that you have, because we essentially do have a system where, you probably wouldn't want to call it capitalist, but I think we have, maybe we can agree on capitalish. We have a capitalish system where really production is characterized by private production. It's mostly private production. And government is left to handle some things that are hard for various reasons for the private sector to address, like infrastructure. I don't know of a good example of like a big, completely private infrastructure project. There are some public-private infrastructure projects. I don't know of there probably is one. I don't know of a good example of a big private infrastructure project. But it's just because of the difficulties in, getting land rights and hashing out, those agreements with every landowner are difficult enough to resolve that it's helpful to have the government. I realize you probably think that just because it's helpful doesn't mean you should steal people's land, is probably how you would characterize that. I guess I should probably touch on maybe disagreements about the definition of freedom. Because I think that's important. And
we recognize liberty is different than freedom, just to throw that out.
Oh, really? Okay.
Liberty
what's the distinction?
What people allow you to do, that's liberty. Freedom being the stepping out of liberty, what you're able to do.
Okay.
Or
like
perhaps
literally.
the natural state of humans.
Is this like the positive negative liberty distinction?
Positive negative distinction in what way?
It like positive rights is like some people say I
yeah.
have
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
from having to look at your face
Right.
versus
Right. Yeah. There's certainly a distinction right there.
Freedom too. Yeah.
yeah, I remember this imam got on Hannity and he was like, there's freedoms from and there's freedoms too. And, we want freedom from the influences of evil Western culture. But yeah, we have to be sure that we're defining terms.
Yeah. That might encroach on some of the producers and consumers of the evil Western culture in question, I would think. But yeah, I guess, this world in libertarian view where, you rent an apartment or you own a house, and then to get onto the sidewalk, you have a sidewalk subscription, and to get on the road, you have a road subscription. And you have to pay to access all of these just to get around. I imagine that would impose some pretty severe constraints on the mobility of people who aren't wealthy. And it also means that as you go about your day, you're kind of bogged down thinking about these microtransactions. And I think that would probably not make people feel very free, particularly to people who aren't very well off. And I kind of think in a manner, and this is, to have like freedom, you kind of need to have options. Like I think that people who are living a life of subsistence agriculture are, whether they're coerced or not, is kind of irrelevant. They're not very free because there's not much they can do. I mean, you're kind of like a servant of necessity, and you have to go out and farm every single day or you'll die. And so part of the idea of redistribution is enhancing people's options. And I think that does enhance freedom, and at not a very big cost to the freedom of people who are, making more money and are bearing the burden, because that money doesn't expand the range of options that much. So I kind of see, freedom as being about having choices, and I don't think redistribution takes away that many choices, but I think it can potentially give people a lot of choices.
Well, we're getting close to our time here. I would like to just throw something in to respond to that point, and then we'll give you the last word and we can wrap up. But on the topic of charity, here's my worldview on that. If we believe that democracy, that is the majority opinion, is a viable solution to organized society, then we have to recognize that the charitable instinct of people would exist absent the government. So for those instances where a libertarian economic model, you could say, has difficulties or fails to address the nitty-gritty, so to speak, I would argue that's where you get the voluntarism, the charitable nature. And, never mind the fact that right now we're losing over half. I've heard models as high as 80% to government bureaucration.
Yeah, I've heard 1 to 5. Tom Woods said it's 1 to 5.
Right. But in any case, I mean, again, one of many examples. This might be a conversation we want to extend. Basically, the way I'm seeing it is where the areas we're getting caught up is the practicality. And those are certainly interesting and important questions and things that we intend to address. We need really an episode for each one because they are very complex topics in and of themselves. But Andy, if you would like to throw in any last thoughts, I do really appreciate your participation with us here today, and I hope we can get you on again. But any final words?
Yeah, I do have to get going here, but I think we should continue this some other time. I would love to talk again sometime if we could do that.
Yeah, I would like that as well. I think we were just scratching the surface. We kind of we went in a very backwards way of doing things. All of us have debated many times before, I'm sure, and we ended up defining our terms at the very last moment, which is a massive faux pas right there. But I think Danny and I, this being our first dialogue on on podcasts, we're trying to make it reasonable, entertaining, and also trying to make it concise too, so that we can get you out on time. But that being said, we would love to have you back on to talk about these things. We can get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty, because I'm not even sure, even though we disagree on much, we were being rather polite about things, and I would love for the gloves to come off a little bit more. So Andy, thank you very much for joining us. It was our pleasure, and hopefully you'll accept our invitation to come on in the future.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is Flagship Freedom, Michael and Danny signing off. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Goodbye.
See you next time.
And that one desire is you. And I know nobody else ain't gonna do.